The Brussels Report podcast.
Welcome to a new episode of the Brussels Report podcast. My name is Pieter Cleppe. I'm the editor-in-chief of BrusselsReport.eu. And this episode will cover the topic of Iran and the relations between Iran and the West, which are, of course, very important for multiple reasons. I will have two guests, and my first guest is Rebecca Schönenbach. She is an independent researcher in Islamic finance. So welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here.
It's my pleasure. And as we speak, the West and Iran are very close, according to some sources, to revived GCPOA deal. Or less close, according to some other sources. So, what's your view on this? How close are we?
Well, as of yesterday, we are further away than before, because I don't know if you heard it, but yesterday the Iranian delegation handed in a proposal, and both the US and the European representatives said that it is a very disappointing proposal. So they're not going to agree on the terms proposed by mainly the EU delegation. They didn't specify what was proposed, but they were very disappointed. So I'd say we're not closer to a deal than before, but further away.
Okay, very interesting. I mean, in your view, do you think that Europe should have taken the concerns issued by Israel more serious? Because already when the deal was closed by Obama, Israel was always dead against, and they were warning that ultimately this deal was also very bad for Europe. But in practice, the way I see it, European politicians were always more than happy to close a deal, and they generally did not see to understand why Trump was blowing up the whole deal. So obviously, from my view, I mean, trade with even hostile countries is in itself, under certain conditions, of course, is a good idea. What's your view on this? Is Europe too, let's say, too ignorant or not careful enough when it comes to the security dangers presented by Iran?
Well, I think it was a kind of naive approach, as we have seen in the same way, like with Russia. The belief was that the more you engage, the more the danger of attacks decreases, which simply isn't true. And the Israelis were right by warning the EU that the armament of Iran is going to continue, not only the nuclear proliferation, but also their missiles program. I lived in Israel for 2 years, and I can tell you it's not very pleasant to be attacked by missiles. It sometimes seems to be reported like fireworks. It's not. The Iranian regime is supporting Hamas and Islamic Jihad with $30 million per month. So it's not a small sum. They use the income that was freed by the deal in 2015 to up their armament, to up their programs, and also to not only attack Israel via their proxies, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and sometimes Hezbollah in Lebanon, but also to spy on Europe. For example, in Germany, we had in 2018 more than 10 Iranian agents who spied on Jewish institutions within Germany, including Jewish kindergartens, and planned to attack them. We had already in 2016 Iranian agents spying on the head of the German-Israeli society and planned an attack on him. So we have several activities that were clearly aggressive and not really on the basis of some kind of engagement in developing a peaceful relationship. So the actions of the Iranian regime were always very clearly aggressive, and that is a pity, seeing that the hope in 2015 was that through the engagement, Iran would profit economically, the Iranian population would be awarded the chance to grow economically and also get a little bit more freedom, and Europe would be safer from attacks, and also Israel, and that just didn't become true.
And maybe first, I want to discuss, let's say, the argument made by Israel that the deal allowed Iran to develop a nuclear weapon in secret. I mean, is that correct, or
It
do
seems
we
to
not
be.
know?
We do not know, because it seems to be. I mean, we do know that they approached the threshold of developing a nuclear weapon fast. So at the moment, they're like 2 to 4 weeks away, according
Wow.
to experts, from developing a nuclear weapon, not an atomic bomb, but a nuclear warhead. So they increased their capabilities. Even the International Atomic Energy Agency said that they clearly have indication that they enriched uranium to 60%. So that is the level that is needed to develop a nuclear bomb. So they clearly did that. Whether they did that in the period from 2015 to 2018 or after that, after Trump declared the deal over, it's probably both. I mean, they probably prepared before 2018, because all their other actions, including the missile program, spoke that they're not abiding by the contract. I mean, they made it clear also in the last weeks that they're not willing to abide by any contracts. So it's probably both. And at least what we know is that the proceeds that they generated after 2015, after the sanctions were lifted, were invested into armament and into developing their nuclear program, and not into peaceful means.
Okay. Okay, very interesting. And of course, so I'm Belgian. So in Belgium, we had this huge debate on a potential prisoner swap, and I would say what sort of struck me was that the person who is in the Belgian prison is a former Iranian diplomat who was sort of the lead organizer of a planned terrorist attack on an Iranian opposition congress in Paris. And thanks to the Belgian justice system, in cooperation with, I think, the French, this person was jailed, whereas I would say where he belongs. And obviously it's crazy to engage in such prisoner swaps. Otherwise, you give an incentive to Iran to just take Western tourists hostage and then swap them. But what I mean, I can't think of many examples of countries where the regimes sort of go beyond merely taking out dissidents. I mean, that's bad enough, right? That's very bad. But to actually plan a full-fledged terrorist attack, even in the West, in Paris, I mean that is quite something. Maybe I think Libya has done that in the past, if I'm not mistaken, but I don't think there's so many examples, right?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's not the first. It's not the first attack they planned, and they were already successful by carrying out attacks in Germany on opposition figures. In Burgas, they bombed the bus and killed not only Israelis but also the driver.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
According to the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center, they killed 160 persons, opposition figures, in foreign countries within the last 35 years. So, and of course, they risk other lives. It's not that they just execute their own opposition, they also attack Masih Alinejad, who is a women's rights advocate in the US. They already several times tried to attack
Yes,
her.
I saw that. Yeah.
One of my friends is the Iranian dissident Mina Ahadi, a German citizen now who lives in Cologne, and she has been under police protection several times because her family was threatened, because she led a campaign against the stoning of women that was successful, by the way. So the Iranian regime had to stop stoning women after 2006 due to her campaign,
Okay.
and she is regularly threatened. So they do that on a regular basis, and they don't only threaten opposition figures and Israelis and Jewish members. but they also threaten anybody who speaks out against them, because their main aim, and I don't know if you know that, but in the Iranian constitution, it's stated that they want to export the Islamic Revolution. And that
Okay, I
has
didn't know that.
been the package deal with the Iranian regime. That's one of the basic, let's say, one of the main aims of their foreign policy is to export the Islamic Revolution. And that might sound quite silly in Western ears. Yeah, I mean, we wouldn't take that serious if somebody told us we are going to conquer the world, especially because Iran is not that powerful in terms of economics and so on. But they mean it. And we have to take them serious, as we have to take Russia serious when they say they attack somebody. We have to take Iran serious, because they won't
Yes.
stop. It's not rational. It's something that is in their DNA, that is not a rational thing that we can discuss with them. They're not going to say, oh no, we changed our mind. And they have
I think
repeatedly underlined that.
it's a very important point, because obviously we cannot sort of save the world from despots. The democratic world, I think, has no ability to export democracy. I mean, it would be great if we could, but I'm very skeptical that we can. And I think we've seen in Iraq what the risks are if you topple a dictator. You open up a tribal can of worms. But indeed, like you say, it's written in their constitution that they want to intervene abroad. They have intervened abroad. They have even gone as far as organizing terrorist attacks. So a lot of it is actually, defensive from our side. So that's a very important point. Actually, I want to discuss what you mentioned. The links with Russia. I mean, there's of course many parallels, but both regimes are sort of at the outskirts of Europe, more or less. And to what degree are they actually allies? To what degree are they rivals? I mean, Russia is also intervening in the Middle East. I'm sure the interests do not always align, but yeah, are they allies? Do we see them coming closer,
Well, at the moment they're
Iran and
coming
Russia?
close. Yes, I think at the moment they're coming closer. There were several cooperations. I mean, Putin, you probably saw the pictures, famously visited Tehran together with Erdogan. And
Yes.
then you saw this three-headed monster. To say, if we see these pictures, posing for pictures, they cooperate on a number of things. I mean,
NATO leader Erdogan.
yes, exactly. I mean, there have been also, Turkey is very interesting in this equation, but let's stick with Iran and Russia, because there have been several cooperations in the last few months. I mean, there have been cooperations for years in the Middle East, as you said. Both of them have backed Assad in Syria, due to different interests. So both, I mean, Assad is an Iranian proxy. He depends totally on the Iranian regime, and the Russian interest was to contain them, but still keep it stable. So they supported Assad by keeping him in power, but at the same time allowed the Israelis to attack Iranians, let's say, outlets in Syria. So they kind of worked with both sides, both Israel and the US, and Iran and Assad. So they were both allies in keeping Assad in power, but also not aligned on the goals. But at the moment, Russia sees Iran as a good way to evade sanctions, as it did, by the way, in the past. It helped Iran to evade sanctions. I don't know if you heard of Reza Zarrab. It's one of the biggest money laundering
No.
scandals in the world. It's an
Okay.
Iranian who evaded Iranian sanctions via Turkey with the help of Russia. And he was also, in his beginnings as a criminal, he was trained by Russia. So there have been cooperations before, and now they're trying to cooperate on a number of issues. Iran exported drones to Russia, or helped them to develop a training program with drones. Russia launched a satellite for Iran from Kazakhstan, which probably is used for surveillance of Ukrainian troops movement. There have been some exercises, some deals to evade sanctions for Russia for spare parts, technical spare parts for machines, especially aviation. So to import them from China via Iran to Russia. And of course, once the sanctions are lifted on Iran, Russia tries or plans swap deals with Iran. So the Russians are going to export their oil to Iran, and the Iranians are going to export the same amount of oil towards the West. So that is the easiest way to evade sanctions, and this is
And I believe
going to happen.
they have also agreed to pay in their own currency, right? And try to sort of
Exactly.
reduce the role of the dollar.
Yeah, that's probably not going to happen, but
Yeah, sure.
they're not an economic force on their own, neither Russia nor Iran, but what they have is metals and oil, and this is
Yeah.
something they built their power on.
Yeah, quite a separate debate, of course. I mean, you have people who claim that all this weaponizing of the dollar will ultimately, reduce its role. Apart from all the money printing, I mean, different debate. I mean, personally, also, I'm skeptical if you just look at the economic weight of these countries. I mean, there's also China. That is supposedly gonna come up with a reserve currency, if you can believe certain theories. But then the top cronies of the Chinese Communist Party do not even keep their assets in China. And actually on that topic, do we need to see Russia, Iran, and China as an alliance, or is that a wrong analysis?
Well, there is an alliance because China is brokering their power base. And what we have to understand, and that is very, very important, is that the EU is not as important as it thinks on an international arena when it comes to China and India. Both countries have refused to join the sanctions because they want to keep a power balance. India wants to keep a power balance between Russia and China wants to keep a power balance with the European Union and Russia. So they are not considering the European Union as the strongest factor in the deal. The US, yes, but not necessarily the European Union. And China is already the biggest importer of Iranian goods and oil. So it will be a huge factor if the Chinese support Iran, and they will probably. That will come into the equation, and they already do it now. And of course, with
I
Russia,
see.
it's a friendly foe relationship, yeah, because they have long common borders. I worked in Russia a couple of months. The Russians' biggest fear is that China might take back some of the territory in the far east of Russia. So they
Yes.
don't.
Yeah.
They are very wary of Chinese foreign policy. So it's not a friendly relationship, but they still
Yes.
cooperate.
Interesting. So last but not least, so if you would name three things that the European Union can do, or the EU and its member states, to actually, be more effective towards Iran and the Iranian-Russian cooperation, what would it be?
Well, the first thing I think that is necessary is to understand that Iran is a threat, and it's a threat that can be contained, and this has to be acknowledged because it's not being acknowledged much in the EU debate at the moment. So
Hmm.
once we understand that the Iranian regime is not an ally but a threat, then we have to think about ways to contain it, and then the first thing to do would be sanctions. Impose
Hmm.
sanctions, strict sanctions, keep them. Don't try to circumvent them like France and Germany tried with Instex to evade US sanctions, but
Yes.
join the US by sanctioning Iran
Hmm.
severely. The second thing I would say, what would be really useful is a Magnitsky Act in each and every one of the EU countries that would enable to sanction individual Iranians of the regime who engaged
Yes.
in crimes against humanity. That is
Hmm.
very important because that would be something that really hurts. And of
I
course,
mean, if I may, before you go to the third one,
uh,
comment on your suggestion for sanctions and Magnitsky sanctions. Well, full disclosure, I've always been relatively skeptical of sanctions. But I think if you look at the history of it, particularly also against Iran, um, and even South Africa, which is often cited as a successful example. I mean, it's not in reality. Cuba, of course, it probably has made the regime in Cuba stronger. So there's of course no doubt that these are our enemies. True, but yeah, like how do you respond to people very skeptical of sanctions? And secondly, Magnitsky sanctions. I'm a lot more positive about that. It makes a lot more sense that we sort of go after very targeted figures of a regime. Uh, totally fine, sounds great. But has this been successful?
The Magnitsky sanctions, or do you mean
Mhm.
sanctions in general?
Both.
Well, I think the Magnitsky Act is really a very sharp weapon, because most of the families of the Iranian leading figures, as of the Russian leading figures, by the way, have family in Europe. They have
Okay.
daughters and sons studying in Europe. Their wives build companies in Europe. And to sanction them and their families is a very, very sharp weapon, because they don't like that. When
Yes.
sanctions hit them personally, they will react. And sanctions
Yes.
in general, I think they are working. I mean, it stopped effectively Iran to use its income to build weapons before 2012. I mean, you could see that
Oh.
building up to
Okay.
2018, when they got money, then they used it for weapons. If they don't have any, they can't use it for weapons, and they will
Okay.
use it for any kind of weapon that is in their reach. So I think they were working, but they're not done thoroughly, and that is a problem within the European Union that you can see now concerning Russia as well. That
Mm.
not everybody agrees on following through. And even in Germany, for example, it's a paradise of money laundering, because it's very, very difficult with the German laws to determine who is the owner of an asset and then to sanction
Mm.
that asset. So it's made impossible by a number of regulations that should be reviewed and then
Yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah.
fully imposed. As long as we don't have that, then the easiest thing would really to be the Magnitsky Act, and I think that would really work.
Yeah. Well, I think at least when it comes to the targeted sanctions, I think that's definitely worth trying. And yeah, it makes no sense that these regime families can just freely enjoy life here in Europe. And then I interrupted you. Your third suggestion to the EU, what would that be?
Well, after recognizing that the Iranian regime is a threat, what was the second one I said? To impose
That's the first one.
sanctions. Yeah, that was the first one. The second one is to impose sanctions and the Magnitsky Act on national levels to enable every one of the EU countries to impose sanctions on a personal level. And the
Hmm.
third one is to review our own policy, our own foreign policy, both on nation level but also on EU level, and to really review how it was possible that the EU enabled Russia to become a power that is able to invade Ukraine, and how it enabled by always still assuming that the Iranian regime is going to foster friendly relations by the GCPOA, how it was able to enable the Iranian regime to develop a nuclear program and then to change track. And I think that is the really the biggest problem. It's not only about sanctions, it's about the way we deal with dictatorships and to understand the threat to democracy, because it is a threat not only in parentheses to Israeli and Jewish persons and institutions and opposition figures. It is a threat to democracy. We talk about hybrid warfare with Russia because of the Russian
Hmm.
propaganda, but the Iranians on a lesser scale have tried the same thing. So they have outlets like the IZH in Hamburg, directly under the guidance of the Iranian regime. They have used servers in the Czech Republic to spy on European companies. They have
Mm.
tried to put out some propaganda that was largely unsuccessful, but still, and their enemy is democracy. And we have to understand that by strengthening these regimes, we undermine our own democracies and the rule of law. And that is very dangerous. And so we have to understand it's not only a threat to Israel, it's a threat to us, and we have to develop a consistent strategy to counter those hybrid threats.
Rebecca Schönenbach, that was very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
For the second part of this podcast, I'm very happy to have with me here Kambiz Ghafouri, who's an Iranian-Finnish journalist and an expert in foreign policies. Welcome, Kambiz.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So earlier with Rebecca, I already discussed the prospects for a deal between Iran and the West. But it would be interesting to have your take as well. What do you think this is realistic to materialize anytime soon?
The fact that how long it remains for us to have a second deal, a new deal, is highly depend on the non-JCPOA related demands, especially from Iran. So for a better understanding of the situation, let's have a quick review of what happened to the 2015 Iran deal. In 2015, world powers and Iran agreed on a plan of action called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA. I doubt it is a comprehensive plan. Later I will explain why I say so if we have enough time, but let's go back to the deal. On one side, we had Iran, which was supposed to limit its nuclear capabilities and allow the IAEA a 24/7 monitoring of its nuclear sites. On the other side, we had E3+3, the UK, France, Germany, and the US, China, and Russia. They eased international sanctions on Iran, as well as some unilateral sanctions. So the outcome was Iran could not enrich uranium by more than 3.67%. Iran could not have more than 202 kilograms of uranium in the country, so it had to export the excess amount, for instance, to Russia. And it could not use modern centrifuges. Only the first generation, called IR1 centrifuges, were allowed to work, and some limited research and development programs with other machines. The world powers promised to suspend the economic sanctions, which they did at that time, and confirmed it in the UN Security Council through Resolution 2231. However, things changed when President Donald Trump came to power and started his term in 2017. He called JCPOA a bad deal. And under his leadership, the United States announced its withdrawal from the deal in 2018. So, is the deal dead? The answer is not yet, because on paper, there is still a deal between Iran, 3 European countries, Russia, and China. But is the deal working? The answer is no. The deal is in coma. So the only way for the deal to revive and start functioning is a rejoining of the US. And after victory of Joe Biden in the US presidential election, the new US administration expressed its will to revive JCPOA. This time, Iran thought it is the time to get more and more from Washington, so it put some non-JCPOA related demands on the table. What are those demands? For instance, Iran demands removal of IRGC from FTO list, foreign terrorist organizations list, the closure of Iran's safeguard probes in IAEA, and Iran asks Biden administration to guarantee that the next US government will not withdraw from the deal. So those are impossible demands. So if Iran resists on those demands, we won't have a deal because, for instance, regarding the IAEA questions from Iran, those questions are not related to JCPOA. under
And
Iran.
did Iran not drop this demands, or am I mistaken?
See, Iran is somehow softening the demands. Still,
Okay.
President Ibrahim Raisi of Iran 2 days ago insisted that without closure of the IAEA safeguard probes, there won't be a deal. So, as I said, under Iran's NPT obligations, the country must report any nuclear material or site. In 2018, Israelis found some documents showing undeclared places in Iran, which their activity goes back to early 2000s. The IAEA inspectors went there and found traces of uranium. They now ask those ask that from where those uraniums came, and what are the uranium's destiny. So where are the materials now? And those are serious questions because it is IAEA responsibility to make sure that no enriched uranium is in the hand of irresponsible people or entities or non-state actors or state actors who are seeking illegal nuclear bomb. Can US or even the whole E3+3 stop the investigation? The answer is no. Only IAEA Board of Governors has the authority to decide on the matter. So if Iranians still resist that this is a precondition, then we won't have a deal. And another thing, for example, Joe Biden or any American president cannot decide for its successor, for the next president of the US,
Yes.
and cannot limit the next president's authority. It is illegal in the US. So it's another
Yeah.
impossible demand. Or again, removal of IRGC from FDO list. If President Biden's administration do this, Republicans and even some Democrats will grill the administration in the U.S. Congress. The question would be, how come while IRGC-backed Shia militia or militants target American troops in the Middle East, notably in Iraq, for instance, while IRGC arrests American citizens in Iran and uses them as hostages to receive ransom from the US, how you suddenly become sure that IRGC is not a threat anymore? So those are some demands that are, I call them impossible
Sure.
demands. Yeah. And there are also other difficulties related to the JCPOA itself, like the extension of so-called sunset clause of the JCPOA. That's also a long story. So if I go back to your question, the deal could be reachable, but I don't think it lasts for long, because as soon as the Islamic Republic receives petrodollars, it will increase threatening U.S. interest in the Middle East and elsewhere. It threats against Israel will be more serious,
Yeah.
like what Tehran did before after the 2015 deal. And again, another U.S. president might decide to withdraw from deal. So I think a revived JCPOA will be even weaker than the version 1 of the deal.
Well, very interesting. And maybe one more thing about this. Do you agree with the claims made by Israel that this GCPOA deal allows or used to allow Iran to develop a nuclear bomb in secret?
It depends. So look, now we know that how many Iranian nuclear sites we have. Those are declared nuclear sites. So IAEA knows, for example, in Natanz, in Fordo, there are some activities. For some time, IAEA inspectors had access to those sites, and even now, under NPT, they can request access and go and check what is happening there. But what if there are some secret sites that no one knows about those? That's a serious question, because Iran has a history of hiding something. In early 2000s, in 2002, for the first time, world the world came to know that there are something going on in Iran. So before that, the operation was the covert operation was ongoing, and no one knew about that. So there are always the danger of having something somewhere we don't know and we are not aware of.
I see. Okay, and then maybe let's move to the allegations that Russia and Iran are basically planning to increase their cooperation, specifically to enable Russia to avoid the Western sanctions. I mean, to what extent is that the case?
Look, surely it will after a possible Iran deal. I can promise you that there will be a lot of Russian companies and entities working under Iranian name in the future in Iran if no sanctions targets Iran anymore. Iranian economy is not a transparent one. There can be a lot of Iranian bank accounts with no monitoring. Let me remind you that Iran is in the FATF blacklist for its failure to combat money laundering and terrorism financing. So Iran would be a heaven for Russians to circumvent sanctions. It is as clear as crystal. If we in the future, if Iran, we see an Iran without sanctions, so it means that Iranian companies can deal with other companies all around the world, and if Russia wants, they can operate under an Iranian name, an Iranian company. So you will see the name of Iranian company, and in reality, some Russians might deal with the world and try to circumvent the sanctions.
And like already in the past, were there attempts made to allow Iran to avoid the Western sanctions through Russia? Basically, the inverse. Have we seen some evidence of that already in the past, or?
Exactly. There were some attempts, for instance, the petroleum swap. So Russia used to buy Iranian petroleum and uses it for its internal use, and instead of that, increase its export to the world. That was one thing. Another thing was a kind of ruble real treaty that two countries tried to avoid US dollars and even euros, and tried to deal with each other in their national currencies, so they could avoid international monitoring. And from other hand, Russia helps Iran a lot to access to some materials that it couldn't buy from Western markets. China did also the same thing. At this moment, the thing would be changed because Russia itself is under sanction, and in the future, if Iran sees itself free and without any sanctions, then they can do it from their own side. They can deal even with Russians and import their petroleum. They can import even Russian products and use it internally, and such of things will happen. But the nature of Iran-Russia relations is important. Look, historically, they are not allies. There are very bad memories of Russian interference in Iran, especially
Mm-hmm.
during the 19th and 20th centuries in Iranian collective memory. The Russian Empire had an oppressive role in Iran. Iran was forced to sign the infamous Treaty of Golestan in 1813, another Treaty of Turkmenchai in 1828. Both treaties were followed by two Russo-Persian wars. So, with that history, anti-Russian sentiments has always been so high among Iranian citizens. Among citizens. So you may ask that with this anti-Russian sentiments among Iranian people, how there was the Iranian regime to get close to Russians? The answer goes back to the nature of the Islamic Republic. It is
Mm-hmm.
anti-West to the bone.
Yes.
So now Tehran and Moscow have a common enemy. They cooperate, but at the same time, they are rivals. Even
Yes.
now, under sanctions, each regime tries to give more discounts on its oil price to countries like China to overcome the other one and to sell the sanctioned oil. And the other thing we should keep in mind is there is a deep gap between Iranian people and the Islamic regime in Iran. Once
Okay.
there will be a chance for Iranian to decide for their country, things will be changed. So, in
Mm.
short run, today's Iran and Russia are allies, but this alliance won't work if Iranian people could win in their fight for democracy.
And yeah, maybe going on that, what are the prospects you think for the Iranian opposition?
I think Iranians are doing their best, especially inside Iran. Every day we see some demonstrations, some protests all around Iran,
Mm-hmm.
from retired people to teachers to workers. All are trying to raise their voice. And also, outside Iran, there are people who try to convince the international community to stay with Iranian people, not with the regime, because we see some kind of appeasement policy, and it proved it didn't work with Iran. But trying to empower civil society of Iran, I think will have long-term positive results for the world,
Mm.
because you cannot convince a regime like the Islamic Republic to behave normally, and you can never convince them. For 4 decades, this is their behavior, and
Yeah.
only we will have a long-lasting positive result when people of Iran could win their fight for democracy against the oppressor regime.
And to what extent I was also having this discussion with Rebecca.
Mhm,
I was making the case that if you actually look at the track record of sanctions, it's not very good. I mean,
mhm,
the Iranian sanctions, I think, have not been a great success. Of course, sanctions
mhm,
against Iraq, sanctions against Cuba. I mean, even South Africa, sanctions against South Africa, which is often cited as an example for successful
mhm,
sanctions.
mhm,
It actually took a long time for apartheid to disappear, and it was mostly a
mhm,
result of domestic pressure, not so much the international pressure. So, I mean, at least that's sort of instinctively how I personally look at this. That said, if you could point at sanctions that work, fine, great. And Rebecca was making the case that before 2012, the sanctions actually worked quite well.
mhm,
But yeah, maybe Magnitsky sanctions, or let's say very targeted sanctions against members of the regime,
mhm,
I would personally think that's a better way forward, at least worth trying, as opposed to very broad sanctions that ultimately weaken the economy and ultimately damage the population more than the regime, and sometimes even, especially in Iran, which has great Persian nationalism and sentiment, tend to turn the people against the countries imposing the sanctions. Or am I seeing it wrong?
No, you are right. First, we should keep in mind that what brought Iranians to the negotiation tables in 2015, before 2015, it was in 2013 that they started negotiations. What brought them to the table was the effect of sanctions. So sanctions are effective somehow. But targeted sanctions, of course, would be more effective. The Iranian people should not be the target of sanctions. The Iranian regime should be the target of sanctions. And there are very legit questions that Iranian people ask. They ask, how come that the son of a hostage taker, one of the people who took American diplomats hostage in Iranian embassy in Tehran, and kept them for 444 days. How come that her son is now in the US studying and working there, while ordinary Iranians cannot obtain even a tourist visa?
Yeah.
And how come that the former official of Iranian regime, a former minister of Islamic guidance, who defended Salman Rushdie's fatwa, defended the murder of Salman Rushdie, is now living in the UK?
Wow.
So I think those questions are very much legit. People,
incredible.
yeah. These are the questions Iranian people ask. So if
these are, I'm sure, the questions that Western people ask as well, and yeah, probably the answer is lack of awareness, and these kind of these people slip through the nets of or very dysfunctional immigration policies.
I doubt that the European or American intelligence services do not know the former Iranian minister. It's impossible.
Yeah, absolutely.
There are. This is something very weird if you believe so.
Very strange.
So if we have sanctions, then the regime officials and their children should not be able to have American or European permanent resident cards. So
yes.
That's why I think we don't have targeted sanctions or real sanctions, because Iranian officials inside Iran suppress Iranian people and collect money and come to the West and easily live here in Europe or in the US or in Canada with their money, and no one asks questions. So I think those are some flaws in the sanction rules. So Iranian ordinary people are suffering, but Iranian authorities do not care at all, because sanctions does not hurt them. Sanction must hurt Iranian authorities, not Iranian people. And as we see now, Iranian authorities are living in luxury penthouse inside Iran. They can come and visit Western countries freely by multiple Schengen visas. They come here and go back, and no one asks any questions. That's one thing. And the second thing is, I think, as I mentioned before, a comprehensive plan with Iran. I mean, why I said that JCPOA was not a comprehensive plan of action, because a comprehensive plan must address human rights issues as well. It must address long-term and fundamental problems, not only the immediate ones. Look, the former Iranian Foreign Minister Ali Akbar Salehi once said in an interview, the interview is now on YouTube, he said that it is good that our problem with the West is limited to nuclear issues and not human rights issues. So why should we focus on human rights issues? As you mentioned, we must take lessons from South Africa too. Apartheid regime has also, it had also a nuclear weapon program. After fall of the regime, people of South Africa decided that they don't need nuclear weapon. It will happen in Iran if European politicians focus on the empowerment of the Iranian civil society instead of dancing tango with a regime that might put a knife to their back at any time.
Yeah. Well, super interesting. So thank you so much, Kambiz Ghafouri.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, and let's definitely stay in touch.
Sure.
Thank you.
The Brussels Report podcast.